Tonight, what's unfolding across the Russian frontier is nothing short of astonishing and deeply consequential. Imagine this: Russian troops stranded in the freezing wetlands of their own supply corridor, cut off from communication, surrounded by rising floodwaters, under a barrage of surprise strikes that have paralyzed their only remaining escape route. Sounds like the plot of a Cold War thriller. But this is happening right now. That thousands of Russian soldiers had become trapped near a swollen river following a coordinated series of strikes. The world stopped to watch. It was not simply another frontline clash, it was a calculated entrapment, exposed the fragility of one of the most heavily fortified military operations in recent memory. Yeah. Imagine the scene: columns of armored vehicles bogged down in mud, bridges collapsing under the pressure of water and fire, and troops stranded as the land itself turned against them. Chaos by accident. It was the direct result of precision, timing, deliberate strategy, and nature's unrelenting force colliding all at once. The river, logistical lifeline for Russian troop movements, had become their greatest obstacle overnight. Torrential rains had already softened the terrain for days, swelling the riverbanks and eroding the support structures of crucial bridges. Then, at the height of the flooding, came the strikes: rapid, synchronized, effective. Within minutes, the main artery connecting the forward Russian units to their central command was obliterated. A symbol of strength, a network of armored convoys and heavily guarded crossings, was reduced to twisted metal and flooded craters. Not merely delayed, they were immobilized. Satellite images later revealed the full extent of the disaster. Marooned in the marshlands, supply trucks submerged, and artillery pieces sitting idle under sheets of rain. Communications lines were disrupted. Chatter reportedly descended into confusion. The Russian army, known for its structured discipline and central command efficiency, suddenly faced the one enemy it could neither predict nor control: total isolation. For troops trained to move with precision and coordination, the sudden loss of mobility was catastrophic. Some units attempted to create makeshift rafts or repair damaged bridges under fire, but the current was too strong, too relentless. It became a scene of desperation. The most seasoned officers found themselves helpless against both man-made destruction and nature's fury. Reports from drones hovering above captured eerie visuals, tanks half submerged, soldiers forming human chains to rescue stranded comrades, abandoned as engines failed in rising water. The muddy fields became quicksand traps, swallowing equipment that had cost millions. Regroup only exposed the soldiers further to incoming fire from unmanned aerial vehicles circling the skies, as if the battlefield itself had turned into a living organism, breathing, moving, and swallowing everything in its path. What made this situation even more remarkable was the precision of the strike timing. Analysts now believe the attackers had monitored rainfall patterns and soil saturation levels for weeks, predicting the exact moment when the riverbanks would be weakest. This was warfare that blended meteorology, surveillance, and military intelligence into one calculated move. The floods did not merely assist the strike, they completed it. As water surged through the broken crossings, nature did what artillery could ensure: that no rescue or retreat could happen swiftly. Face of modern warfare, where timing is as lethal as firepower and where terrain becomes an ally, not an obstacle. Inside Russia was being tightly controlled. Describe the flooding as a minor, the strikes as repelled, and the situation as stabilizing. Yet leaked audio and intercepted communications painted a starkly different picture. Soldiers pleaded for evacuation, commanders demanded fuel that could no longer reach them, and reports of frostbite and hypothermia began to surface. Trap had quickly become psychological. The realization that they were cut off, that no reinforcements were coming, began to eat away at morale. Starts to doubt its survival, discipline collapses. And in those marshlands, discipline was eroding faster than the riverbanks themselves. Observers saw in this event a defining moment, not just a flood, an unplanned convergence of precision warfare and environmental unpredictability. The largest armies are vulnerable when strategy overlooks geography. The Russian military, with all its might, technology, and manpower, powerless by the combined weight of water and timing. It wasn't a clash of armies, it was a clash of elements. As the hours turned into days, the situation deteriorated further. Attempts to airdrop supplies failed due to storm winds. Helicopters risked being targeted by anti-air systems positioned on both sides of the river. Soldiers began to light fires from vehicle fuel to stay warm at night, weigh their positions in the darkness. The line between survival and combat blurred. They were no longer fighting the enemy. They were fighting the cold and the water that surrounded them. This was no longer about tactical retreat. It had become a fight for existence. And yet, beyond the mud, the wreckage and confusion, there was something symbolic in this moment. Power had met its boundary. The soldiers stranded in the flood were not merely casualties of war. They were evidence of the limits of control in a world that refuses to bend to force alone. Fired, every order given, there are still variables that no general can command. The river ran high, the rain fell harder, and in that surge, military was brought to a standstill. It was a reminder to every observer, every strategist, who are watching this unfold, that dominance is not merely measured by numbers or weaponry. Sometimes, beneath you, that decides the outcome. And on that flooded riverbank, it did. The precision timing of the strikes that trapped thousands of Russian soldiers near the flooded river was not a coincidence. It was a masterstroke of strategy, a demonstration of how modern warfare has evolved beyond brute force into a sophisticated symphony of timing, intelligence, and environmental manipulation. What looked like chaos on the battlefield was, in truth, a meticulously choreographed operation executed at the exact moment nature was ready to play its part. Been falling for days, saturating the soil, raising water levels, and weakening infrastructure. Military analysts now believe the strikes were deliberately delayed until that perfect convergence, when man made pressure and natural conditions would collide with no path forward and no safe way back. It was as if the attackers had studied the rhythm of the storm itself, the beat to drop before delivering their most devastating blow. Timing has always been the soul of military success. Full of examples, Normandy, Stalingrad, Desert Storm, where the right moment meant the difference between victory and disaster. But what makes this event distinct is how seamlessly precision intelligence and natural elements were intertwined. As meteorologists tracked the rising floodwaters, intelligence units monitored Russian troop movements and satellite data pinpointed exact choke points. They didn't just attack the bridge, they attacked the timing of dependency. Every convoy that crossed those bridges in the preceding days became part of the trap, knowingly moving into a zone that would soon be cut off by both fire and flood. The strikes came when troop density was at its peak, when resupply was mid-transit, already narrowed by weather. In one swift move, the attackers turned geography into strategy and weather into weaponry. Made the strike so effective wasn't just the accuracy of the missiles. It was the orchestration of anticipation. Terry sources suggest that multiple data streams were fused in real-time satellite imaging, radar tracking, hydrological forecasts, and ground reconnaissance. This wasn't impulsive warfare, this was predictive warfare. Commanders didn't simply react to weather conditions, they leveraged them. Precise hour when the river's current would be strongest, the bridge foundations weakest, and the visibility lowest due to fog and rain. Moment, precision strikes were launched, slicing through steel and concrete like surgical instruments. Within minutes, the bridge was gone, and with it, Russia's lifeline to thousands of troops vanished beneath the floodwaters. For soldiers on the ground, the attack seemed to come out of nowhere. 1 minute, forcing supply convoys. The next, explosions shattered the air, the earth beneath them trembling as structures collapsed into churning water. Survived the initial blasts were met with a new terror, the sound of the river roaring louder, breaking through its banks, swallowing everything in its path. Panic rippled through the ranks. Vehicles tried to reverse, only to be mired in mud. Communication officers attempted to reestablish links with command, but power lines were down and radio signals were jammed. It wasn't just an attack on infrastructure, it was an attack on time itself. Every second that passed widened the gap between control and chaos. The brilliance at operation lay in its understanding of rhythm, of when to strike, not just how. Today isn't about overwhelming force, but calculated disruption. The attackers didn't need to destroy every outpost. sever the artery that connected them.
Yeah.
By striking when nature's fury was at its peak, the chaos would sustain itself long after the missiles stopped falling. Water, mud, and debris did the rest. In that sense, the operation became self-perpetuating, a strategic domino effect set into motion by a few well-timed hits. Also underscores the profound shift in the modern battlefield, one where meteorology, AI-driven analytics, time data fusion play as crucial a role as boots on the ground. The attackers had studied the weather patterns with near scientific precision, them not as obstacles, but as assets. Satellite images show the strikes landing exactly as the river breached its containment lines, multiplying the impact of destruction. It was as though nature itself had become an accomplice. Such coordination suggests the use of advanced modeling systems capable of simulating environmental effects on infrastructure. In essence, not just military intelligence, it was environmental intelligence weaponized. From a psychological standpoint, strikes during a natural disaster amplifies fear in ways conventional warfare cannot. Soldiers expect the enemy to attack. They do not expect the earth sky to turn against them simultaneously. The moment of realization, when troops saw the floodwaters rising around the remnants of the destroyed bridge, merely tactical. It was existential. The precision of that moment sent a message that transcended the battlefield. Nature can be turned into a force multiplier in modern conflict. It shattered morale, sowed panic, deep sense of helplessness that no command order could counteract. In Moscow, this timing has become a political nightmare. Struggling to explain how an entire segment of their army could be caught so unprepared, how their intelligence failed to anticipate both the weather and the enemy's exploitation of it. State media continues to downplay the extent of the damage, but independent analysts note that the coordination and timing of this strike will be studied by military academies for years. It's being hailed as a textbook example of temporal warfare, an operation where victory is achieved not just by force, but by patience, observation, perfect strike at the perfect time. The story of this strike will linger long after the waters recede. It will be remembered not only as a physical disaster for the Russian army, but as a psychological and strategic masterpiece, a moment when timing became the deadliest weapon on the field. The storm, data, and discipline merged in the chaos that followed. Timing rewrote the rules of war. The flood may have washed away the bridge, washed away any illusion that strength alone determines survival. In this battle, the victors didn't just strike, they waited. And in modern warfare, sometimes waiting is the most devastating attack of all. When the main bridge network collapsed under the weight of both missile strikes and relentless floodwaters, military's supply chain began to disintegrate hour by hour, minute by minute. What had once been a meticulously organized logistical lifeline, fuel convoys, ammunition carriers, food transports, supplies, suddenly turned into a scattered trail of immobile vehicles and stranded personnel. The collapse wasn't just structural, it was systemic. That river link went down, the rhythm of war stopped. Trucks that should have been delivering fuel to forward artillery positions were now submerged in water, their engines drowned. Communication relays that coordinated shipments went silent. The soldiers waiting on the front line were left staring at the horizon. Was coming. Not food, not ammunition, not rescue. The supply chain is the heartbeat of any army. It is what keeps the weapons firing, tanks rolling, and the soldiers alive. But in this case, that heartbeat faltered. The destruction of the bridge severed the artery through which every critical supply flowed. Suddenly, units found themselves calculating how many rations remained, counting bullets instead of targets, conserving power on radios to preserve battery life. What began as a tactical setback quickly mutated into a logistical nightmare. The front lines grew quieter not from victory but from exhaustion. Tanks stood idle, field kitchens stopped burning, their supplies either washed away or spoiled. Necessities like clean water and dry clothing became luxuries. The flood compounded the chaos in ways no enemy could have planned better. Rivers of mud making even all-terrain vehicles useless. Helicopters sent to drop emergency supplies faced gale, force winds, and poor visibility. Make It Through had to choose between rescuing stranded troops or dropping cargo. There was no way to do both. It became a cruel trade. Off, sustain the fight later. Some pilots reported seeing entire convoys half submerged. Through brown floodwater, like distress signals. From above, looked less like a war zone and more like a drowned landscape of confusion and despair. Inside the command structure, panic began to ripple. Senior officers tried to reroute supplies through alternative paths, but the network was too tightly woven around that main bridge system. Led through soft terrain or flooded valleys, engineers worked around the clock to establish temporary pontoons, but continued strikes and the unrelenting rain destroyed their efforts before they could stabilize. The supply system, once described as the backbone of the Russian advance, was now a collection of broken links in a chain that could no longer hold together. What made this collapse even more devastating was its psychological weight. For the soldiers stranded near the river and fatigue were beginning to replace discipline, prided themselves on efficiency, were forced to scavenge from abandoned trucks or share single meal rations among entire squads. Radio messages intercepted by Western intelligence painted a grim picture: soldiers begging for resupply, commanders promising reinforcements that never came, voices cracking with disbelief as they realized they had been forgotten, or worse, sacrificed to maintain the illusion of control. It wasn't just a battle for survival, it was the slow unraveling of belief in the system that sent them there. In warfare, logistics is often invisible by the spectacle of missiles, tanks, and front-line heroics. But here, logistics became the story. Without supply, strength means nothing. Communication, strategy dissolves. The precision of the strikes that targeted that bridge didn't just destroy a crossing, it destroyed time, predictability. Soldiers could no longer depend on schedules or orders because every hour brought a new uncertainty. Longer needed to fight them face to face the river, the mud, and their own hunger were doing the work. From a strategic standpoint, catastrophic. Armored divisions depend on constant refueling. Artillery batteries require steady ammunition delivery. Units rely on transport lines to evacuate the wounded. With those lines gone, component of the military machine began to rust figuratively and literally. Fuel depots drained within days, forcing tanks to be abandoned mid-field. Units fell silent as shells ran out. Field hospitals reported shortages so severe that basic medical operations were being conducted under candlelight. The infrastructure of war had become a skeleton, and that skeleton was crumbling with every passing storm. Back in Moscow, the narrative remained tightly managed. Officials insisted that resupply operations were proceeding as planned, that temporary disruptions were being addressed swiftly. But inside military circles, it was impossible to ignore. The loss of that supply chain exposed a weakness that Russia's war machine could not mask: dependence on centralized logistics. A single strike in the right place at the right time had paralyzed an entire operational front. Defeat in battle. It was a collapse in structure. Describe it as a new kind of warfare, where the destruction of a bridge can ripple through an army like an electric shock. Physical connections, but the will to fight. Without resupply, modern militaries grind to a halt faster than ever before. Moment that proved the battlefield isn't always defined by explosions. Sometimes it's defined by silence. The silence of engines that won't start, of radios that won't respond, of soldiers staring at empty skies, waiting for planes that will never come. Chain collapse near that flooded river wasn't just an operational failure. It was the unraveling of momentum, the evaporation of control, of vulnerability beneath the facade of power. It became a living symbol of what happens when an empire built on logistics loses its balance. The flood didn't just wash away bridges. It washed away certainty. And in the art of war, losing certainty can be the most devastating loss of all. Broke its silence about the catastrophe near the flooded river. It did so with words carefully chosen, polished layers of propaganda. A single sterile statement emerged from the Ministry of Defense: the situation. They said, those three words echoed across state television, repeated by presenters whose expressions betrayed nothing, carried the familiar rhythm of denial. But behind the walls of the Kremlin, reality was far more chaotic. Briefings painted a grim picture: thousands of soldiers stranded, communication lines fractured, and supply convoys lost to the rising waters. The state, which prided itself on control, suddenly found itself facing a crisis it could neither conceal nor repair quickly enough. In modern Russia, silence often speaks louder than speech. When the government refuses to show images, when official reports are delayed, when the nightly news avoids a topic altogether, it usually means the truth is too damaging to broadcast. That was precisely the case here. Independent satellite imagery and foreign correspondents documented the destruction in chilling detail. Russian state channels continued to air segments about infrastructure improvements and diplomatic meetings. The gap between what the public was told and what was actually unfolding on the ground grew into a chasm. In that gap, fear and speculation began to thrive. Soldiers posted desperate messages on social media asking if anyone had seen their sons or brothers. Those messages were deleted within hours. Disinformation. The silence became suffocating. Inside the Kremlin's inner circle, the tone was reportedly one of disbelief and anger. Senior officials demanded explanations from generals. How could a single operation cripple an entire logistical corridor? How could the army, as one of the most powerful in the world, be reduced to a stranded force within days? But those questions were rhetorical. Dared answer them truthfully. The chain of command had already started to fray. Commanders in the field too afraid to admit the extent of the disaster. Reports upward. Numbers were misedged, losses understated, temporary tactical adjustment replaced or retreat. It was an echo chamber of denial, and in that echo chamber, decisions made in confusion only worsened the situation. As journalists abroad pieced together the story, international pressure mounted. Satellite photos circulated online showing rows of submerged vehicles and makeshift camps along the river's edge. Intelligence briefings publicly contradicted Moscow's official narrative, the situation as operational paralysis. Even pro-Russian channels abroad began to question why no footage was being released. Still, Russian state media held its line. Anchors spoke of strategic repositioning, a phrase that has become a euphemism for loss. Maps shown on air remained unchanged, and destruction simply hadn't happened. But the cracks in the story were widening, and silence could only hold for so long. Closed doors. President Putin's advisors were divided. Some argued that acknowledging the setback could allow for a more controlled narrative, spin the flood as an unprecedented natural challenge, something no military could predict. That admitting weakness would embolden both domestic critics and international adversaries. In the end, the regime chose the oldest play in its book, distraction. Within days, state-controlled outlets shifted focus to other regions, broadcasting reports of new military drills, diplomatic visits, provocations. The goal was simple: drown the truth in noise. But in the age of real-time information, noise cannot always silence the signal. Russian citizens, long accustomed to decoding the language of censorship, began to notice what wasn't being said. Telegram channels and independent journalists operating in exile filled the void, leaking details from soldiers' families, intercepted communications, witness footage. Each new leak chipped away at the illusion of control. By the time Moscow tried to reassert its narrative, had already moved on from speculation to certainty. The disaster was real, and the Kremlin's silence was proof of its scale. Inside the military ranks, silence had a corrosive effect. Soldiers stranded near the river felt abandoned. They could see the flood, feel the hunger, the drone of enemy aircraft overhead, yet their own government spoke as if nothing was wrong. The dissonance between and the state's silence was devastating. Morale didn't just decline, it collapsed. Officers struggled to maintain order among troops who no longer trusted the words coming from above. It's one thing to face an enemy on the battlefield. Realize your own leaders have chosen silence over rescue. The propaganda machine, once Moscow's most effective weapon, under the weight of its own contradictions. The official story was that the army was advancing smoothly. The truth, anyone with an internet connection, was that soldiers were trapped, starving, and freezing. This dual reality, one for the cameras, one for the battlefield, illustrated a deeper fracture than the Russian state, the widening gap between performance and reality. Empire built on control eventually reaches a point where controlling the narrative costs more than admitting the truth. This was one of those moments. continued, whispers of dissent began to spread in Moscow's corridors of power. Advisors reportedly argued about who should bear responsibility. Defense blamed the weather, the generals blamed intelligence failures, intelligence agencies blamed sabotage. The real problem, however, was systemic, the refusal to confront reality before it became unmanageable. When truth is treated as a threat, problems metastasize into full-blown crisis. The silence that was meant to protect the state had become its own weapon turned inward. And yet, most haunting image of all is not of the flood or the destruction, but of that silence itself, the official calm in the face of private chaos. The Kremlin's refusal to acknowledge the suffering of its own soldiers wasn't just a political calculation, a reflection of power's most dangerous instinct to deny vulnerability. That built the illusion of strength now exposed the fragility underneath. Yes. In the end, the silence spoke louder than any speech could. Revealed everything Moscow tried to hide, that control, once lost, cannot be rebuilt through denial, and that even the most disciplined silence cannot hold back the sound of a crumbling truth. The human mind is the first battlefield, and in this war, collapse among the stranded Russian soldiers has become as devastating as the physical damage itself. Destroyed the bridge and the floodwaters closed in, what followed wasn't just logistical paralysis. It was a slow unraveling of morale, a belief, and the haunting realization that the enemy wasn't only across the river, but also within their own minds. Thousands of soldiers, freezing mud and cut off from command, began to experience the crushing weight of isolation, fear, and uncertainty. The battlefield had turned silent. But inside each soldier's head, the noise was deafening. At first, there was discipline. Commanders barked orders. Soldiers formed defensive lines, believed that reinforcements would arrive. They had been told that the situation was temporary, that Moscow had it under control. Hours stretched into days, and the river continued to rise. Confidence began to decay. Supplies that were meant to last a week were already gone by the fourth day. The radios that once buzzed with constant updates now produced only static. Huddled together under makeshift tents, their uniforms soaked, their boots filled with water. The cold seeped into their bones, and with it came despair. A soldier can fight hunger for a day, cold for a week, but it's uncertainty that breaks him first. The moment the soldiers realized that no help was coming, something shifted in the air. The sense of unity fractured. Some began scavenging abandoned trucks for anything edible, crackers, wet bread, a few cans of beans. Others argued over fuel, refusing to share the last drops of diesel that could power a generator for warmth. Officers tried to restore control, out communication from higher command. Their authority evaporated. Discipline isn't sustained by fear alone. It requires faith in the system, dies with it. Reports from intercepted radio chatter reveal the tone of their desperation. Soldiers described entire platoons breaking apart, men wandering into the floodwaters, searching for higher ground or rumored supply caches. Shouted at their superiors, demanding to know why evacuation hadn't begun. Others simply went silent, staring blankly at the wreckage, detached from reality. Psychologists who've studied combat trauma say that isolation in hostile environments accelerates mental breakdowns faster than direct combat. When the body is deprived of food, warmth, and leadership, the mind begins to turn against itself. Hallucinations, paranoia, even hysteria are not rare. They are expected. The conditions in the flooded zone created a perfect storm for mental collapse. The constant sound of rushing water mixed with the whine of distant drones. The nights were pitch black, illuminated only by lightning flashes that briefly revealed the wreckage of their own vehicles. Sleep became impossible. Each noise in the dark could be a drone. Sniper. The lack of control, the helpless waiting, was torture of a different kind. Some soldiers began keeping notes in small notebooks or on scraps of paper, writing messages to their families they knew might never be delivered. Others reportedly buried personal belongings in the mud, believing the riverbank would someday serve as their grave. This moment particularly haunting was the silence from Moscow. Soldiers could handle danger. They could handle combat. What they couldn't handle was being forgotten. The official line that everything is under control didn't reach them. It mocked them. The disconnect between propaganda and reality became psychological poison. When a soldier realizes that the state he fights for won't even acknowledge his suffering, of duty begins to crumble. In war, morale isn't just about courage, it's about meaning. And for those stranded near the river, officers tried to maintain routines, ordering morning formations and assigning watches, but the effort was hollow. Without supplies, these rituals became reminders of futility. Some troops began refusing orders altogether, preferring to sit silently by the water's edge, staring across at the distant lights of the opposite bank. The human instinct to survive began to overtake the military instinct to obey. No longer a structured army. It was a collection of frightened individuals bound by circumstance, not command. As frost began to form over the mud, exhaustion blended with psychological collapse. Frostbite set in. Soldiers wrapped their feet in torn rags or plastic, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Attempted to swim across the swollen river, desperate to escape, only to vanish in the current. Those who stayed watched in silence, unable to help, risk the same fate. The emotional weight of helplessness became unbearable. When the mind reaches that threshold, fear turns inward. It becomes guilt, and finally numbness. Experts often talk about combat effectiveness, but few talk about the fragility of human endurance under prolonged uncertainty. Happened along that flooded river wasn't just a military entrapment, it was a psychological implosion. Severed more than supply lines. They had severed hope. Each day that passed without rescue was a message: you are alone. The most powerful weapon any enemy can deploy. Meanwhile, Russian families at home were living their own psychological war. And wives scoured unofficial channels, looking for names on casualty lists that didn't exist. The government's silence mirrored the soldiers' isolation. Sides in parallel helplessness. The soldiers faced the flood, their families faced the void of not knowing. Together, represented the true cost of deception, not just the loss of life, but the slow death of trust. As the days turned into weeks, suggests that many soldiers no longer identified as part of a mission. Their conversations shifted from military objectives to survival tactics. Rafts from debris shared rumors of escape and waited for dawns that brought no change. The once cohesive force had dissolved into fragments of humanity, clinging to whatever piece of faith or sanity he could find. What makes this moment unforgettable is not just the strategic failure, but the haunting image of thousands of trained soldiers, men conditioned to fight without fear, being undone not by an enemy assault, but by silence by nature, by the realization that they had been abandoned. The psychological collapse of those stranded troops wasn't an accident, outcome of a system that treats soldiers as instruments rather than individuals. In the end, was not defined by gunfire or explosions, but by something far more powerful. The sound of hope fading away in the cold wind. Once mighty army sat frozen in the mud, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Analysts began calling the flooded entrapment near the Russian River a strategic turning point. They weren't exaggerating. There wasn't simply a military mishap or an isolated event. It was a moment that rewrote the rhythm of the entire conflict. Precision strikes, factors, and humor converged in a way that transformed a single battlefield into a symbol of modern warfare's evolution. What makes this incident extraordinary isn't just the number of soldiers trapped or the scale of destruction, but the manner in which strategy itself was redefined, measured in firepower and numbers. Now, we are seeing a shift toward intelligence-driven warfare, where timing, weather, supremacy can dismantle even the most formidable force without a massive exchange of fire. Describe this event as a tactical choke, and the term fits with haunting precision. Point in warfare is more than a location. It's a moment of vulnerability where power collapses under its own weight. Bridge became that exact moment for the Russian forces. For years, their strategy relied on overwhelming logistics, sheer volume, scale, and consistency. But that advantage turned into their weakness. When the bridge fell, so did the illusion of invincibility. Not about destroying troops, they were about cutting oxygen from the lungs of an entire military operation. When a supply line dies, suffocates. What happened by that river was the slow suffocation of momentum played out in real time. In many ways, Operation marks a new frontier in hybrid warfare. The attackers didn't rely on mass assaults. They relied on precision, patience, and a deep understanding of timing. They used the floodwaters as a weapon, the terrain as an ally, and the enemy's overconfidence as ammunition. Shift from brute strength to strategic intelligence. The world witnessed a battle where environment and data replaced artillery as the dominant force. The soldiers stranded in the mud weren't defeated by superior numbers. They were defeated by foresight. The strike's brilliance lay in its restraint. Placed missiles did what weeks of fighting couldn't achieve. The landscape itself became a prison, also forced the world to reconsider the balance between nature and warfare. Historically, armies have fought against the elements, rain, snow, obstacles to overcome. But here, the elements were embraced, calculated, and synchronized with technology. Data was as valuable as satellite imaging. Hydrological models became as critical as battlefield intelligence. The river didn't just flood by chance, it became the centerpiece of strategy. Analysts are calling this the dawn of geo-synchronized warfare, a style of combat that aligns military action with environmental timing, the planet's natural forces to amplify tactical outcomes. It's war not against nature, but with it. Politically, the implications are even more profound. This single event rippled through corridors of power like an earthquake. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from victory to vulnerability, which had built its image around strength and endurance, found itself portrayed as reactionary and brittle. And the strikes combined to expose a reality that propaganda couldn't conceal, that struggles to adapt when conditions change too quickly. This wasn't just a military setback, it was an ideological one. Botan control had lost control in the most literal sense. Across global news networks, the story was framed as both tragedy and turning point. Observers saw it as evidence that modern conflict no longer rewards size, but precision. Smaller, smarter operations are now capable of achieving the kinds of disruptions once reserved for full-scale invasions. And in that understanding lies the deeper shift. Has become a contest of intelligence, not just fire. The side that can see further, think faster, and strike with precision wins, not through destruction paralysis. The trapped soldiers weren't victims of defeat in combat. They were victims of a strategy designed to deny them movement, communication, of warfare that wins by freezing time. The psychological impact of such a turning point reaches beyond the battlefield. Soldiers witness the collapse of their command's capability. It erodes faith not only in leadership, but in the very concept of stability, of military dominance, carefully crafted over years of state-driven propaganda, suffered a visible crack. Divisions became metaphors for the broader state, vast, armored, and seemingly powerful, yet immobile when precision strikes expose the weak points. Social media, images of submerged convoys and silent soldiers began to circulate, the narrative of control that Moscow had fought so hard to maintain. Every frame of that imagery told a story of an empire that had overreached, not by strength from the outside, but by miscalculation from within. For the international community and the strikes represent a pivotal study in modern strategy. Demonstrates how asymmetric tactics, once seen as tools for smaller nations, can redefine large-scale conflicts. Precision, timing, now stand on equal footing with artillery and manpower, is entering an age where a well-timed storm can change the course of a war as effectively as a missile barrage. The blurred lines between environment, data, and defense have created a new kind of battlefield, one that exists as much in algorithms and climate models as in trenches and front lines. Makes this turning point so powerful. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a declaration or a decisive battle cry. It came quietly, disguised as a flood, hidden in the rhythm of rain and the hum of drones. One moment, the Russian forces were advancing. The next, they were trapped, not by soldiers, but by water and silence. That silence was the new sound of war, the silence of control slipping away. Global recognition that something fundamental had changed. The flood near that river didn't just halt a military advance, the definition of warfare itself. It reminded the world that dominance is not measured by how much force a nation can project, but by how precisely it can act. The lesson is as old as strategy itself, but newly realized in this modern theater. Strike is not always the loudest. It's the one that arrives at the exact moment when the enemy believes they are untouchable. And in that quiet precision, history turns. As those soldiers wait in the dark by the river's edge, their trucks sinking deeper into the mud than just a battlefield event, we're seeing a turning point. That even the mightiest can falter when the ground beneath them gives way. And that's where we leave it tonight. Floodwaters rising, supply lines broken, narrative slipping through the cracks, just like the bridge that once held it together. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.